Hi class, I hope this finds you well. This week we're going to be engaging with a subject that I very much enjoy and use in my own research, and that is linguistic anthropology. I want to preface by saying linguistic anthropology is not exactly the same as linguistics. There's a lot of commonalities which I mentioned briefly earlier on in the semester. But of course, it's anthropology, and we like to insert culture and discussions of how we really think about language into this discussion. As a bit of a review, I'm going to show a slide here that I did previously present to you all earlier on in the semester. But I want to sort of give you a refresher and kind of expand upon what this slide really is talking about. So linguistic anthropology primarily, not always, is focused on semantics, which really is the meaning of language and the meaning in language. Quite literally, what does a certain word mean? This ties to pragmatics and, okay, why did they just say that particular word in this sentence as an example? It really is talking about the meaning making process and our way of sort of registering, okay, it's okay to say this in this context, or I'm really trying to say this but saying something else. For instance, if we're talking about migrants entering the United States, let's say illegally over the border, me saying illegal alien may have a different connotation to it than me saying asylum seeker. If someone says illegal alien, they are trying to convey certain meanings behind that statement, as opposed to someone saying asylum seeker, again trying to convey meaning, but using different words pragmatically to convey what they are trying to say essentially. And those two words, of course, have very different connotations to them, one being negative and one being, in a sense, positive or understanding of the experiences of the other, or the capital O, essentially. So language influences thoughts, thought influences language. Again, okay, I need to use the specific word, and they both influence culture. For instance, if it is quite common in, let's say, media to mention illegal alien, that is going to shape how larger the larger aspect of the culture sort of conceptualizes asylum seekers, to use that term. Vice versa, if, let's say, a more liberal leaning news station is using asylum seeker, then more liberal leaning individuals may start to be saying that more than a more conservative leaning individual saying illegal alien. That sort of clash potentially at the cultural level may lead to debates and discussions. And that sort of also is how new ways of thinking are developed and new ways of talking about certain issues are presented to each other. That is how sort of language plays into thought. Again, we're having to choose the words we're picking depending on our audience, and their reaction to that meaning making process and your pragmatic use of words may end up influencing the larger cultural practices in a given society. Also, let's give another example of a language ideology, which I mentioned earlier on in this semester. A language ideology really is the assumptions that we have about a particular language. As an example, we largely, in the English-speaking world, like to say that France is a romance language or a romantic language because it sounds more, to us at least, flowery and romantic. However, that is largely just an ideology that we have about the French language, but that also plays into how we conceptualize French culture as more romantic, as more flowery, essentially. A individual in France may laugh at that assumption, but it's just because we put certain, or we prescribe certain meanings to certain phrases, to certain ways of being, certain ways of presenting yourself, essentially. And that's going to have an influence on how different cultures interact, as an example. You might exoticize French language because of that connotation of it being a Romance language, as an example. So now I'm going to break down a few of the sort of fundamental units that linguistic anthropology and linguistics really uses. When you're doing math, you have particular ways of making a formula, and that's how you can study that problem, correct? It's the same thing for a language. And one key portion of that, at least how anthropologists conceptualize language, is the concept of a symbol. And that's something that refers to something else and conveys meaning. Language, of course, is also not just the spoken word. It is any verbal or nonverbal medium or means of communication that we use to convey a certain meaning when we're saying something or trying to move our hands to present something, as an example. Therefore, languages are also symbolic systems. They basically are a compilation or amalgam of different symbols that we are using to convey certain meanings when we are having a discussion. Some other examples of nonverbal communication are sign language, flags as an example, and also the clothes we wear. If we are walking outside wearing a particular, let's say, uniform or piece of clothing, we are trying to convey meaning about ourselves. If we walk into, let's say, a job interview wearing nicer formal wear, we may be trying to present ourselves as more formal or as more professional in some sense. It's just the clothes we wear, it's just what we decided to wear that day, but it has meaning attached to it as well. In terms of flags as an example, you can think of the United States flag as a compilation of different symbols. Think about why we have it as red, white, and blue. What do the stars convey? What does the red stripe convey? What does the white stripe convey? What does the blue convey? As it was conceptualized, these symbols have meanings, but they may be interpreted differently. For instance, if you show someone the American flag in China, they may have a very different understanding of what that flag represents than someone, let's say, in the United States. You may show two people in the United States the flag, and they may come up with very different ideas of what that flag represents also too. But there also was an intended meaning to the colors of the flag as an example. That was a pragmatic use of those colors at the time to try and convey a certain ideology about what it meant to be a member of the United States, for instance. Sign language actually also is really interesting because there's American Sign Language, there's Nicaraguan Sign Language, there's Chinese Sign Language. There's a lot of different kinds of sign language. So when I'm saying sign language, I don't just mean the ones that you probably have seen when you're walking about on your daily lives, when we actually could interact with people. And those different symbols and meaning-making processes, just like a verbal language, is going to change over time. It's not static. It has rules to it, yes, of course, but those rules also change over time as people use words differently and make new meanings out of previously established phrases and terms. So on the subject of the flag, let's sort of break this down. The two obvious ones really, of course, are that there are 13 stripes for the original 13 colonies. There are 50 stars for the 50 states that we have. But then what do the colors mean? To give an example, as they were originally conceptualized, red was a symbol of hardiness and valor. Blue symbolized vigilance, perseverance, and justice, while white was a symbol of purity and innocence. These sort of one-word examples of what the flag was trying to convey were also an attempt to convey what it meant to be an American or a member of the United States, as an example. And those ideologies are really inputted on us, let's say when we are pledging allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, when we are growing up in elementary school or high school as well. When you are told to say the Pledge of Allegiance in class, that's not just to test your rote memorization skills. It is also there to sort of reify that you are a member of the United States and that you prescribe to the ideologies and ideals of what it means to be an American. But again, people may have differing or diverging opinions of what that actually means. And for instance, people outside the United States think it very odd that they sort of force students to stand up and do this in the morning in class, as an example. And also they think it's odd that there's an American flag in almost every single classroom, or there's required to be an American flag in every single classroom. Things that we take for granted or don't really think about, again, can sometimes be questioned as odd or strange to another culture, for instance, or maybe even people inside of that same culture in the US who think it's odd that they have to stand up and pledge allegiance to the flag every time they go to class, that sort of thing. What I'm really trying to say is that symbols have different meanings to different people. But we are all trying to convey something when we are using symbols. And that sense of conveyance is going to shape how we think about the world also too. And also when we're interacting with each other, using words pragmatically and using symbols pragmatically to convey meaning about something. Also, what I want you to really think about as I'm talking about language really is that there is no one language. There's not one English. We speak English right now when I'm conveying meaning to you, but it's not the same English I might use when I'm talking to a family member or a friend. It's more formal. I am talking more presentory in a sense to try and convey that this is important information. Watch this video. You don't have to watch the entire thing. Let's say watch maybe the first 5 minutes or so. What I really want you to do is just to see that words, of course, have different meanings, and those meanings are influenced by, what's the magic word? Culture, of course, and the history of that culture too. Importantly, also how they interact with each other. And you can see from this video that some things that people say are very strange to someone else. And a word that may seem innocuous to one culture may have a very different connotation to another culture. So, that being said, human capacity to communicate. So, what is that? We all have this. Every human that is born has the capacity for language. It doesn't necessarily mean verbal language. It can also mean that is nonverbal. Body language, as an example, is a good way to think about this. I'm conveying certain meanings without even saying anything when I squint my eyebrows or I tilt my head when someone is talking. That being said, language also is an open system, which constantly creates new symbols and meanings as we interact with each other. In a sense, this is sort of how anthropologists see culture too. Things can be introduced, things can be tweaked, things can be changed, things can be lost, things can be adapted into a language, into a culture. And that's sort of why anthropologists always scratch their heads when people try to separate language and culture, because they, in a sense, are vehicles of the other, and they are intertwined and they're hard to disentangle also too. When I'm saying universal grammar, a linguist coined this phrase, and what he was trying to say is that hardwired in our brain somewhere is the concept and capacity to form words and have a grammar. For instance, that, okay, there's a noun, there's a verb, there's an adverb, and we can kind of just start to fit those all together. Think about that for a second. It's interesting that humans just have the capacity to speak and form words and meanings behind them. However, anthropologists slightly diverge by saying that, of course, culture is going to have a big role in what that grammar looks like. And culture also very much dictates the rules of that grammar also too. There may be a biological component to us being able to communicate, but that ability to communicate is also shaped by the environment in which you grow up in. As an example, when you are, let's say, there's been examples of young children that have been sort of locked away from the world and were unable to communicate with anyone. They, over time, never really developed that language speaking capability or that grammar in a sense. And that resulted in them being unable to communicate despite the best efforts of those trying to teach them. Language can also vary considerably cross-culturally. You can think about this at the macro level for different countries. For instance, speaking English in the United States, speaking French in France, but also at the micro level, there are different ways of communicating. Again, if I am texting somebody, a friend of mine, I'm going to be using a lot of shorthand, a lot of acronyms, and speaking in a more casual manner than opposed to me speaking right now to you, despite you not being able to communicate back to me verbally, in a way that I think is more presentory of the information that I am providing. That is going to shape how you think about me and how you think about the content, as opposed to me being a lot more casual about it, as an example, which some of you may prefer. It's just not the means in which that I am presenting the information. And that may cue you in that I'm trying to maybe present myself a certain way, as an example, too. But think about this also in terms of the intercommunity variations in a given culture or society. Let's take Hillsborough County as an example. Hillsborough County has a high amount of ethnic minority populations, including non-Hispanic Black Americans as well as Hispanic individuals. And there may be a lot of Spanglish, it is often called, where Spanish and English sort of intermingle, and you find new ways of communicating that are more in terms of play or more in terms of what's called code switching, where you're able to kind of hop back and forth. That way of communicating may be very different than, let's say, an all-white affluent community that strictly just uses English as an example, despite there being very little difference in mileage between these two different communities, if you want to put it in those terms. It is unfortunate that I can't do this in person because I think students usually like this activity a lot. So this is what we're going to do. If you can, I want you to pause this YouTube video and sit down maybe with a piece of paper and try to guess the name of all the movies that you are seeing here. And once you do that, transition to the next slide or timestamp on the YouTube video, and you will see the answers. But what I'm trying to convey here when I'm showing this in class is that you also know different languages than you really maybe would have put on paper if asked the question. For instance, I'm sure some of you can get a lot of these. Some of you may only get a few of these, but you are able to interpret different symbols and in your head translate those into meaning or even words or phrases depending on what symbols you're seeing. Emojis or bitmojis really are just symbols. You can think of them almost as like hieroglyphics in a sense. They are a symbol that is trying to convey either a word or a meaning, or both in some senses. I'm going to go ahead and cheat and give you 24 as an example. So you have an eyeglass or magnifying glass, and you have a fish. Most of you will probably already conclude that this is Finding Nemo as an example, or maybe Finding Dory because of the fish in this example too. So keep that in mind and know that you know more languages than you think, and you're able to sort of dynamically switch between using emojis and using English or using Spanish or speaking another language on the fly, and that sort of speaks towards the adaptability of the human mind when it comes to language also too. So here is the list. Some of these movies are pretty dated at this point, so no fault on your end if you couldn't have gotten all of them. But this is just an example again of the way the human mind works, and the human mind is a very complex thing. And give yourself some credit because you most likely are able to sort of piece together different symbols and come up with the intended meaning. And that really is what language is trying to do when people are saying something to you as an example. Keep in mind also too that when someone is saying something to you in terms of pragmatics, there is sort of an agenda behind what they are saying. So think about, okay, why did they just say that particular phrase? Why are they communicating to me in a certain way? You may do this sort of without really thinking about it just because that's just how the human brain works. But just know that there really is a process of someone trying to maybe even sway you a certain direction, or at least to have you understand what they are trying to say when they say a certain thing, if that makes sense. So how do some of the mechanisms come into play to influence language learning? And two of those we're going to be talking about here. There's going to be a decent amount of definitions in this lecture because it's important and they sort of help you sort of conceptualize what I'm saying. The first of which I want to engage with here is enculturation, which I've mentioned before, which is the process of acquiring the characteristics of a culture or group by being immersed in it over time. What does that have to do with language? Well, there is language socialization, which really is enculturation, but for language. It is the process of acquiring language through enculturation. To give an example, when I was growing up as a small child, I was communicated to in English. I was told to speak in English. So over time, I learned English, but I also learned the culture of my local community of the United States over time through that process of meaning making and enculturation. So you really, again, are having a hard time disentangling language from culture because you really learned both at the same time. This also applies to you learning a new culture or a new language. When I go to, let's say, Costa Rica, on a language immersion program, I am learning Spanish, of course, but I'm also learning Costa Rican Spanish in particular, and their way of speaking, which may diverge from, let's say, Spain Spanish. Actually, it does up to a large degree. And additionally, I'm learning the culture of Costa Rica. But think about it in these terms also too. When you are in a high school or college class learning a language, you also are learning some cultural ideologies and symbols when you're learning that language. Because again, it's very hard to disentangle these two things. Also, it is easier to learn multiple languages earlier on in life. Our brains lose a lot of their adaptive capacity, or what's called plasticity, as they become more developed. This is why scholarship supports the notion of teaching young children multiple language at a very, very early age, because they are much more able to process and sort of compartmentalize it in their brain. It is very difficult, unfortunately, for a lot of us that as you grow up in your development and your brain loses some of that plasticity, that adaptability, it becomes much more difficult to learn a new language. That's because our brain is just, it loses some of that squishiness, that stretchiness that allows us to adapt to our environment, in terms of language at least. So in a sense, there is a biological component to this that we need to keep in mind. But also this goes contrary to a lot of movements, let's say in the United States, for instance, that only English should be taught in schools because it may reduce the education quality of children. That's just not the case in the science. It goes against the science in particular. There is nothing in the scholarship that shows that learning multiple languages is detrimental to learning. What is detrimental to learning are policies and educational practices that only favor you learning one language. Because, let's say you are a multi-language speaking household, you now have to navigate that system that punishes you for knowing multiple languages. So you must think about also the societal and structural factors which may inhibit or create disparities in terms of what language is favored over another, what culture is favored over another, what way of thinking is favored over another. All right, so shifting gears back slightly towards sign language again and body language, there is the study of kinesics, which is the study of body language, quite literally. It's studying eye contact, facial expressions, and gestures. This sometimes is used in linguistic anthropology, sometimes in other forms of anthropology as well, but it is very limited because it's very difficult to do. For instance, if I am talking to somebody and they keep looking to the left or they're not making eye contact with me, it may be an indicator that either they're nervous, they're lying to me, or they're uncomfortable with the interview process. However, if someone's very animated and they're leaning forward and they're talking to me and their hands are moving, this may be indicative that they are very passionate about that subject. Linguistic anthropologists have very specific means of measuring this. Like, okay, he leaned forward here at this timestamp, and he was leaned forward for about a minute during the interview. And the only way to really capture this is through video recording. And again, it is very difficult to do. However, there are a lot of individuals that are able to, for instance, study, let's say, a recording of someone speaking and get similar information, for example. Additionally, there's the concept of biomechanics, which literally is basically the physics of our body. We all have hands, well, most of us do, and different cultures can convey different meanings through body language. I mentioned this earlier, that there are different sign languages depending on the given nation that you come from in some circumstances. But let's think about this in terms of our personal space or our personal bubbles. This is the study of space, which is proxemics. Think of proximity here. Watch this YouTube video, and it sort of goes over what I'm trying to sort of talk about when it comes to proxemics. But just remember that in the United States, we have a very unspoken, of course, but very rigid bubble around us when we're talking with someone else that would make you uncomfortable if someone got quote unquote too close, as an example. There is an appropriate distance in which to stand. This is learned behavior. This is not something that is hardwired in our brain. And when, let's say, for example, a foreign student comes to the United States, they may be unfamiliar with that personal bubble. They may get closer than you are expecting. Or they may, as another example, look down when you are talking to them as a teacher. Something that I haven't experienced personally, but I've heard from other professors that, for instance, there are some cultures where to show deference to professors, you must look down the whole time, and to make eye contact actually is disrespectful. While in the US, it's the opposite. You are expected to look at someone in the eye when you're talking with them, and it may be conveyed as being disrespectful if you do not do that. So there's been issues with that where someone thought they were being disrespected in terms of a professor as an example, but really that's just two cultures interacting with each other and both not being comfortable with the other as an example. So watch this video and also know that these boundaries sometimes change. Let's say you're on a crowded bus or a subway. You may have your bubble kind of shrink just given the circumstance. In other circumstances, you may have your bubble expand based on where you are standing and who you are talking with, for instance. So watch this video and then proceed on with the lecture. Paralanguage actually also is very interesting and also very hard to study. You can think of paralanguage as the pitch, loudness, tempo, or duration of sounds beyond the written syntax of words. For instance, to convey you are asking a question, English often has a rising inflection at the end of a sentence. If I said, "You're going to the store," that sounds like I'm making a declaration. You are going to the store. However, if I say, "You're going to the store," that may be conveyed as I'm asking you a question. Are you actually going to the store? That also is really hard to convey via text. I'm sure all of you can think of examples where what you wrote to a friend as an example via text or an email was construed very differently than your intended meaning, because something is lost when you just have the written word that is gained when you are there to be able to see body language, inflection, tone, tempo, how someone is talking. So there are a lot of different ways to study language, and they are very hard to do so, which is probably why, to a large extent, anthropology tends to focus more on the meaning behind why someone said something, because it may give you a better qualitative understanding of really what is happening in a given context or situation, as opposed to the very hard and very murky study of tempo and inflection as an example. Now let's get into two different phrases that some people use interchangeably and some people may misconstrue or misdefine. A common critique and annoyance among anthropologists when we see this happen. You can think of language as often what is referred to as the standard form of a particular way of speaking, such as English or Turkish. To give an example, there is a lot of literature on standard American English. Basically, this is the standard way that education should be provided in the English language. This is standardized, and this is the way that everyone sort of should more or less speak. There are some problematics to that, of course, but let's dive into another term here before I do that, called a dialect. Often referred to as the subordinate, lesser, inferior form of a language. As an example, there's standard American English, then some scholars refer to African American English or African American vernacular English. This is sort of a subset. It is lesser than in terms of this is the common one that everyone knows, standard American English, and then there's this little bubble called African American vernacular English. Under this model, someone that can speak English can mostly understand an English dialect. However, we have already established there is not one English. So what really is being said when someone says, this is standard American English? Well, whose standard is it really? The quote here at the bottom that I have, usually one variety of a language is considered the standard, but this choice is based on the social and political prestige of the group that speaks that variety. It has no inherent superiority over the other variants called its dialects. Linguistic anthropologists and linguists say that languages change constantly, all the time. They're changing right now as I'm talking with you, because you're saying, okay, why did he just say that? That sounds weird, as an example. And because of that, my way of speaking English may diverge from your way of speaking English. Let's say you grew up in Wisconsin. How I pronounce things may sound strange to you. My dialect, quote unquote, may sound different from yours, or my accent, which is how dialect often is portrayed. But again, nothing inherently makes one culture better than the other. Nothing inherently makes one language superior or more correct than the other. Because even the rules of grammar, as they are defined, change over time. And anyone that's studied English knows that English grammar rules constantly contradict each other, or there are exceptions and loopholes. It's because English in particular is a very messy language. So is most languages, but English is very messy. And to say there is a standard way of speaking a language is largely a misnomer. It is incorrect, and it can actually lead to very problematic assumptions of saying, oh, their English is a dialect or it's lesser than ours, for example. So expanding a bit on what I just talked about in terms of a language and a dialect and sort of the power differentials that may be embedded in the sort of distinctions that we make, let's again refer to the Ebonics debate I mentioned and we had a reading on earlier on in this semester. Then there is also the African American vernacular English and also linguistic profiling that is involved in the way that someone speaks and communicates with each other. Watch these two YouTube videos. One is quite recent and one is quite old. The first one comes from the Netflix show Dear White People, and it's some of the cast, crew, and other personalities talking about what it means to code switch and talk in certain ways depending on the audience and what you're trying to convey with. And the other video sort of contextualizes the Ebonic debate. Now, when you watch these videos, also think about what the sort of underlying meanings some of the individuals are trying to convey when they are talking about the so-called debate on either side, really, of whatever camp they fell on. But after you watch that, think about this. Critics say calling this form of language, let's say Ebonics, vernacular English instead of a language is subordinating it as a dialect of white English. If we say this is the standard, this is a standard American English, or this is standard English, if we're saying, oh, this is a vernacular of English, which basically just means a dialect or different way of speaking, we are saying that it is lesser than the sort of standardized way of communicating. Of course, not every American speaks African American English. There is regional variation also too to keep in mind, and different Black communities may speak differently. So to say also that there is a vernacular African American English may also be incorrect. You will find people approaching this from different angles, and it's a very complicated topic, but basically what anthropologist says, hey, if someone wants to call it a language, there's literally no basis to say that they are incorrect. So if they want to call it English, it's a language, it's a language. If they want to call it a dialect or vernacular, so be it. These words have lost a lot of their intended meaning because language changes and morphs and evolves all the time. So it's just a very messy subject, essentially, which may be an unsatisfactory answer to some of you, but that's just the reality in which that we are sort of looking at these topics. I also used to show a video here, but I didn't want to overwhelm you with videos, try to keep it short, where a Black professor runs an experiment where he calls different housing agencies and motel agencies and tries to rent rooms. He uses what he considers to be a sort of more Black vernacular, and then compares that to him calling the exact same establishments with what he considers to be a more stereotypical white American accent, sort of standard American English accent in a sense. And what he constantly finds is that when he is calling with that more standard quote-unquote white accent, he gets a lot more listings and interviews when he is going in to potentially go in and get that position or to get that house or that apartment, opposed to him using a more Black vernacular because of the underlying racial ideologies and underlying racism that a lot of individuals just have in the United States, given the context in which everyone grows up in the United States and the history of the United States. We still have a lot of hurdles to get through, and it's a long, painful process, which, of course, I'm saying from a position of privilege as a white male, but we need to start to find ways to address these very real disparities, and that really is a large portion and point of this class, is to identify problems and maybe find ways that we can start to address them at the very least. I'm saying languages change and that they're messy, but how and why is that the case? Here are some examples, and this list is not exhaustive, but think about it in terms of this. In terms of settlement patterns, let's say there's a new clustering of people. Let's say there is, which ties to the next one, let's say there's a lot of migrants coming in from a particular area of, let's say, Mexico. When they enter a given community, they bring with them both cultural practices as well as different ways of speaking that may be atypical or not commonly seen in a given community. That intermixing and that interplay of cultures and languages will start to develop in different directions, which can lead to language change over time. Then let's think about geographical factors, the isolation of people or forced interaction due to proximity. In terms of isolation, in terms of, again, let's take migrants as an example. If a community migrates to, let's say, a small tropical island and doesn't have a lot of outside contact, new languages and ways of speaking are going to start developing among the community. It's a similar process of sort of passing genes through reproduction. Over time, languages will start to change despite there not being any outside contact, just because language changes so often and all the time that it's inevitable that we will see language change even in a clustered, cloistered community. And then let's think about language contact, people speaking with multiple languages coming together. This is sort of where you get pidgin languages, and a pidgin language basically is when two languages that don't know how to speak with each other start to find ways to interact and form a sort of Spanglish, as an example, to be able to communicate with each other. Over time, those two mixings of languages may result in one language being favored over the other, or there being a new language forming over time, or the cohabitation of two languages also too. But one usually ends up being favored over the other just for pragmatic reasons. And then we think about region and occupation. We see specialized language depending on the task. There's a very famous article in Linguistic Anthropology which goes over the techno-strategic language and discourse of defense intellectuals. Basically, these are scientists that are dealing with cruise missiles and weapons of war in the United States. They have very different ways of speaking, and their strategic operationalizing of certain phrases and terms that may be unfamiliar to us. They talk about payloads, they talk about sensitive targets, they talk about things that may be even construed in a very sexualized manner. You talk about missile envy. You talk about the size of our bombs versus their bombs. This was a sort of feminist critique of the language that was being used. That's the examples that I'm using. But what I'm trying to say is, like, for instance, a doctor is going to have phrases and terms that may be completely non-understandable compared to someone that's not a doctor or a medical professional. He's still speaking English, or she's speaking English, but he's using different words or phrases that may be unfamiliar to you. Then we talk about social class. Different communities, depending on where they come from in terms of economics and social status, may speak differently. Also in terms of education, too. This is just something that develops due to access to education, access to resources, and also who you're interacting with on a daily basis also, too. Then there is group reference. Basically, this is talking in a certain way because you are a certain gender, a certain ethnicity, or a certain age. Older age groups may have different phrases and jargon that they use that may be unfamiliar to a younger individual, and vice versa also too. And there may be, let's say, a certain word falls out of favor for this word, or a younger generation may still be using an older jargon phrase that they've sort of co-adapted over time. And additionally, since gender is a performance, sometimes that performance involves you speaking in a certain way to convey that, okay, I am a man essentially, and this is how men talk. And that may lead to different interactions. In terms of language, think about this. When I'm saying, hey guys, I don't necessarily mean all the men in the room, because English commonly will use this phrase to mean men and women, just hey everybody essentially. Similarly, in Spanish as an example, if there is a large group of individuals, it doesn't matter if there is majority women, you will say them as a collective using male or men gender pronoun essentially, because of the sort of power and gender differences inside of the Spanish language also too. On that note, gender in Spanish, for instance, also applies to everyday objects. Some objects are masculine, some objects are feminine. But that being said, some objects in one language may be considered to be feminine, while in another language it may be considered to be masculine. As an example, I think it's Spanish and Italian. One language sees bridges as masculine. You can think about it in terms of a phallic symbol, of it stretching across water, while the other language conceptualizes bridges more as something that connects each other, and more stereotypical gender for women sort of roles also too. Again, completely culturally constructed and not based in biology at all. It's just how the language developed over time and how people think about certain words also too. A few more phrases that may be interesting or useful to know for you. The language register is the style of speech you use when talking to a certain audience. Again, I speak a certain way when I'm trying to convey information to you right now than I speak to someone else that may be a friend or family member as an example. Code switching is what you heard on the slide about Ebonics and African American Vernacular English. Basically, this is changing your language register to match your audience. If, for instance, someone thinks that I don't speak Spanish, they may code switch into English. And then when they're talking to someone else, they may code switch into Spanish. I saw this all the time when I was in Belize, where individuals that speak Belizean Creole would speak in Creole around me. And then when they wanted to talk to me, they would switch to English, because they know that I don't speak English Creole, or Belizean Creole for that matter. And then there is a language shift, which is the abandonment of one language, such as your primary language, in favor of a new language. We talked about this in terms of immigrants into the United States having to learn English when they enter the education system. Over time, this may result in a context where your parents speak, let's say, Spanish, but you no longer can communicate with them because you only really learned English when you were growing up. Then there is a moribund language, which is sort of tied to this, which is where a language is expected to die because new generations are not learning it. There are certain contexts where languages are seen to be dying, meaning that no new individuals are learning that language. It is not being taught in a manner that will be able to be reproduced. Anthropologists are very concerned about this because, of course, as we mentioned earlier, language and culture are connected, and the loss of language also, in a sense, is a loss of a lot of cultural knowledge about a given way of being and a way of thinking about the world. If you have a chance, I would highly recommend you take Linguistic Anthropology here at USF, because that will be a topic they engage with a lot in that semester as you progress through these different concepts more in depth. Then there is language death, which quite literally is the extinction of a language. No one can speak it anymore. No one is able to understand or recall, let's say, the grammatical structure of the language, what the word sounded like, what their word was for green, as an example. And that loss of knowledge is, well, it's tragic, but it happens all the time, especially as more and more countries are supposed to, through largely economic means and policy, adopt the so-called superior language. When I say so-called superior, I often mean colonial language also too. What I'm really getting at here in terms of language extinction and moribund languages is linguistic relativity, which is a very anthropological term, which means the structures and words of a language influence how its speakers think, how they behave, and ultimately the culture itself. We have a certain way of thinking about the world. But let's take Spanish as an example. When you are learning Spanish, you are learning that some words are masculine and some words are feminine. And with that, you are registering, okay, this is why that may be the case as an example, based on gender norms, which is tied to the language also too. Thus, when people lose their language or it becomes extinct, some aspects of the culture that the language was used to convey are lost over time, which is, again, very unfortunate to anthropologists, and I think it should be for everyone to think about the consequences of that and the loss of generational knowledge that's been passed down for a long time, or being able to communicate with your mother or your grandmother who wants to pass on their heritage and stories to you as a member of your lineage. So watch this final, really listen to this final NPR piece where they have someone talking about their experience with not being able to communicate with their parents. It's, in my opinion, very sad, but also it happens all the time.